All right, continuing our talking about federalism, we want to take a look at how federalism has changed. It is certainly not the system of government that is described in the 10th Amendment. So we want to look at all the things that have happened that have allowed federalism to evolve into a much more modern form of government. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on describing examples of the national government taking more control over state powers. So the last couple of days, we've been looking at those things that are left up to the states. But in modern government, the national government has taken a lot of control of the state's ability to make those policies. So we want to see how federalism has changed over time, and we'll be able to explain federalism changing over time by describing the examples of the national government increasing their power over the states. So what we're looking at is we're trying to figure out how exactly the interpretation of the idea of the federalism system has changed over time. So we want to get started a little bit with the idea that we call dual federalism. This is how we have been talking about federalism so far. So dual federalism explains this system where there are dual governments that each have their own roles, a national government and a state government. Dual federalism would describe the original design of the relationship between the national government and the states. This is laid out for us in the 10th Amendment, telling us that those powers that are not specifically given to the national government by the Constitution are reserved to the states. And so that basically gave us what we looked at the last couple days, two lists, a list of national government powers and a list of state government powers. So in this system, lots of powers are given specifically to the national government, mostly economic and foreign policy powers, and everything else is left up to the states to decide. And this would give the people maximum amounts of freedom to make their own governments. The states would have the maximum amount of flexibility to meet the needs of their citizens. And so we'd probably see a variety of policies across all the states, because the states would have a lot of flexibility to make decisions about things like schools, health and safety, crime and punishment, things like that. This idea of dual federalism, two specific columns, one column of national powers and one column of state powers, is how the government operated and basically was the whole framework that policy was made in up until the Civil War. So there were arguments about the national government's power and arguments about the states' rights, and that was all based on a basic understanding of the 10th Amendment. So we call this system dual federalism, this system that is best suited to allow the states to have flexibility. If it is not written in the Constitution and says the national government does this, then your state has a lot of freedom to control that, and the people are closer to their state governments, and so the people will have more control over their own policies. This would create a system where national and state governments have very separate policies. So you see my Venn diagram again there. I have a red circle and a blue circle representing the national government and the state government powers. You notice there is very little shared space here. There are still some concurrent powers like taxing and prosecuting people for crimes and setting up courts, but there are very few shared areas of power. Things are either definitely a national power or definitely a state power. And this gives the states a lot more power to control their own policies. And so this was a desirable form of government early on when most of the people were pretty concerned about the power of a faraway central government. So this allowed the state governments to make most of the decisions that would impact you about, all the stuff in your everyday life, your roads, your schools, your healthcare, those kinds of things would all be left up to the states because they're not in the Constitution for the national government to do. All right, and this sounds pretty silly, but I promise it will help you remember it, and everyone uses this term. It's in every book. Here you see a beautiful, delicious layer cake. Now, this form of federalism is called layer cake federalism. So we call dual federalism layer cake federalism because those layers are separate. All right, so there's not a lot of mixing there. There is a separate national layer and a separate state layer. So you can think of my Venn diagram there as mostly separate. And this is a silly little metaphor, but it really does help us explain the difference in these two systems. So keep layer cake federalism in mind when you're thinking about dual federalism. And we're going to explain cooperative federalism and talk about how it's different.